Welcome to Changing Higher Ed, a podcast dedicated to helping higher education leaders improve their institutions. With your host, Dr. Drumm McNaughton, CEO of The Change Leader, a consultancy that helps higher ed leaders holistically transform their institutions. Learn more at changinghighered.com. And now, here's your host, Drumm McNaughton.
Thank you, David. Our guest today is Dr. Larry Large, president of the LD Large Consulting Group. Larry's a retired university president and a professional campus administrator with over 4 decades of experience, including Willamette, Oglethorpe, and Sierra Nevada College. Following his retiring from formal roles, he continued his service to higher ed through consulting, specializing in strategic and financial planning for public and private colleges and universities. In addition to his vast experience, Dr. Large has served on many not-for-profit boards. Larry joins us today to talk about the state of higher education and what university presidents must do to turn the ship around. Larry, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Drumm. Thank you.
Just so the audience knows who you are, give us a little bit of your background, if you would, how you got to where you are now.
Oh, well, I worked early on as a very young administrator in graduate school. And in the old Dixon versus Alabama thing, I was a prosecutor for a new due process thing at the University of Oregon. Worked for the chancellor's office in enrollment management for the system of higher education in the state, and then was Associate Dean of Students and Director of Financial Aid. And then I finished my doctorate, my PhD, and went to Willamette University as Vice President for Student Affairs and Administration later on, both. And I also served as Chief Development Officer during that same period of time. I was there almost 10 years. Went to Reed as Executive Vice President, and then back to the U of O to be the Vice President of U of O for a while, and worked in development and other areas of the campus, and really had some rich experiences there, and then was promoted to be the Vice Chancellor of the Oregon University system, was recruited out to go back to Reed for a little while, and then I was appointed president of Oglethorpe University in 1998. Stayed there till 2005, and then I was interim president after that at Sierra Nevada College, now a university, and now merged with University of Nevada, Reno. And then vice president 2010 for Willamette University, and then the founding president of the Oregon University Alliance for Independent Colleges and Universities. So,
well, you've had quite the history, quite the background, which I think really lends well to our conversation today about what's going on in higher ed, the challenges, the trends, etc. So let's just jump right into it. What are you seeing?
Well, what I'm seeing is a lot of things that are really disruptive to the normal culture, at least normal as defined in the last 30 to 35 years. And I see us in the challenges, especially in the demographics. That is such a fundamental part of the economics of our enterprise that it's impossible to ignore that. And that's true in other enterprises, other industries as well. But it's something that we tend not to take advantage of. And it actually then creates for us a counter trend for what happened between World War II and 2008, where our supply and demand was in favor of demand. And now the demand supply curve has gone the other way. And so that demographic, and we've lost, a couple million students, and that cliff, as it's referred to, this coming in 2026 is a very real intervention that we must prepare for in order to avoid surprise and disruptions that will cause us to compromise our mission and our business models further from what has already happened.
Well, we're already seeing that. I typically refer to higher ed as in a mature or declining market when you look at market forces.
Right.
And we're seeing closings. We're seeing folks running deficits on finances. It's not pretty.
No, it's not. And the number of closures in the last little while, I've had clients of 2 Oregon institutions that have closed, and another one of a merger that's occurred here within the state of Oregon alone. And in Vermont, there were closures in 2021 that were substantial and almost monthly there for a while. So the demographics problems are not evenly distributed in every state in the country, as you know well. But and in the West, we've had more of a more advantage in seeing a smaller decline than in the other parts. But even here, we have ended up in the West Coast with significant challenges and closures that are really, really difficult.
Yeah. And the CARES Act, it was great. There was so much finance out there during COVID, but I think that really delayed a lot of the closures that will happen.
When you look at the balance sheets of many of these institutions, both public and private, you will see a distortion in the direction from the pandemic that shows more of a balanced budget for the last 2 fiscal years than is at all probable to continue in fiscal year 23, 24, 25. And so that's going to be a real challenge. And at the same time, the pandemic has produced what I call an accelerator to the difficult overall trends of the business model for the enterprise. And it varies highly between and among types of institutions, but it's significant for everybody, and every campus needs to be looking at that. That accelerator, the same things would have happened, but over a longer period of time, in my view, without the intervention of the pandemic. I think of it, there were underlying conditions, to keep with the medical metaphor, that the pandemic accelerated and brought to our attention and to our actions and our strategies a lot more rapidly than would have otherwise been the case.
Well, as my friend Gordon Gee says, COVID is accelerating needed changes in higher ed by a decade or more. Crises don't bring up problems. They bring to light problems that are already there.
I think he's right. I might say, in slight disagreement, that I don't think it'll take 10 years or would have taken 10 years. I think some of these issues would have arisen without the pandemic in 5 years, or in a few cases even sooner than that. But it would be more complicated. I think the general public will have a little better appreciation for the rapid acceleration of this, so that it's not something that is distinctive to one or two colleges in their neighborhood or where they went to school, that it's a broader set of problems for higher education generally.
And this is happening all across society, all of these rapid changes that are going on.
Right.
And students, I'm sorry, before we even go into the students, I mean, students, there's a lot of mental health issues out there. They've been locked into their homes for 2 years. Students aren't ready for college yet. Their professors are seeing lagging indicators. They basically missed 2 years. So that's an issue. But the affordability plays right into all of the finances stuff.
No question about it. I think it's important to make a sharp distinction between costs, that is, where colleges are investing in their infrastructure and their overhead and their programs, versus the price, what students pay in tuition net of discounting. And discounting itself is a topic that we probably should touch on at some point.
Oh, yeah.
But the cost variables are coming into play as a consequence of increased demands on the part of a more of a population, of a couple generations. Millennials first, but more extreme Generation Z are coming in, where they have a kind of a sense of entitlement and a sense of needing certain kinds of things. Campus safety is one of those examples where the cost variables are huge. Then you also have other kind of amenities, increased medical care on the campuses, exercise facilities, a whole lot of things that 25, 35 years ago were not so prominent in a student's choice or a parent's choice about where to enroll. Therefore, another cost variable that's incredible, and it's not well researched. And at some point, I hope we can get better data on this, but the marketing trends, what institutions are spending. Jenzabar did a brief study on that, but we need increased research on where that cost is so that we can analyze it. And that cost is driven in part because one of the lenses in the recent book that I published talks about how you get a kind of a consumer sovereignty, or you get a kind of a user in control of what's offered, because that imbalance of supply demand, where supply is greater than demand, the supplier then has to adjust to what the demand is literally in terms of programs, degrees, services, and the like. So I'm just touching on some big fat sloppy generalizations on that, but you know what I mean.
It's all of those things, and there's far more information out there about what the actual cost is for the tuition versus the published sticker price. Right. Discounting is up well over 50% at this point.
Yes.
And student loans certainly haven't helped things either.
No, 1.7 trillion plus in accumulated debt among those. And while a lot of the media cover the extreme ends of that, the median debt levels are much more tolerable, but still a challenge. I don't mean to discount, pardon the pun, anything to do with those student loan levels, but it is a real problem. And of course, we've got the national issue now with the President Biden attempting to make some changes in it. But it's an extraordinarily complicated strategy and proposition to manage equitably, and it'll get any kind of consensus among the public broadly as well as among people with debt. It's divisive in terms of different forms of the debt, and especially people who've recently paid it off on their own. It's a very complicated thing, and I think that debate is still in front of us about how that's going to be managed going forward. It's one of the continuing issues.
And it will continue to be as long as there is such a major role for politics in higher ed. I shouldn't say there should be a role for politics, but there certainly is. Florida is a great example of that, where the legislature has now said Florida universities have to change accreditors every 5 years, which you've just added hundreds of millions of dollars to the cost of those universities.
Right.
And the legislatures, they don't understand what they've asked for.
Right. I sometimes have a fantasy about remembering the 1990s, when the world began to accept the terminology of something called an information economy. We would be very well served by, in our democracy, in my opinion, would be to have a similarly structured information government. That is, not to have research groups, to have the kind of things that study, but not make the decisions, but that counsel the committees, the state legislature, the bureaus, and the federal Senate and House of Representatives, so that they make more informed judgments based not just on lobbying investment, but on real data, on information that is parallel to what we did with the economy in the 90s.
Well, it certainly would help if they haven't cut out all the staff on the congressional groups. There used to be significantly more staff who would do this research. Now you've got to turn to lobbyists to get that information. And of course, their duty is not to the country. Their duty is to their clients.
Particular interest,
exactly.
Specific interest. Yeah, no, I think that's right. Anyway, I take us off course here, Dr. Drumm. I didn't mean to do that, but it is the case that we do need more of an informed process on several of these issues. And we've got to look at this generation, the mental health issues. You touched on it a little bit earlier. The mental health issues are very real, and there are lots of investments being made on the campuses now that will add to the cost curve if they're not similarly offset with some reduction in other costs, which will then put the pressure on price increases in the fairly near term.
Yeah. Well, the price increases so far have been less than inflation, but that's not going to last for very long.
Well, no, but I think there are some ways that we can reduce some of those costs as long as we have the discipline to reduce the price whenever we're able to reduce the costs. And that's not easy because there are interest groups on the campus, and not illegitimately, are saying, we haven't gotten raises in the last few years, we're understaffed in this area. And it's easier to identify those than it is to shorten up some of the areas where savings could be made in other services and other programs that would offset that and ultimately drive down the price.
Yeah. One of the things we'll talk about is housing costs. We'll save that for a little bit later, but there certainly are ways to do that. But even the role of faculty is changing. There used to be the traditional, 40, 40, 20, 40 for instruction, 40 for research, 20 for service.
Right.
But that doesn't take in the informal counseling that faculty members are doing. I mean, I just had a guest on the program that'll be coming up shortly who, she'll ask a student, how are you doing? And the student is very naturally will come out and say, this is what's going on in my life. And say, the faculty member's like, okay, what do I do with this?
Right. And the faculty member's not particularly prepared for it. We've been too efficient. Something I observed many, many years ago is that we had a very efficient division of labor on campuses, so where the faculty weren't dealing with this, but that's no longer the true. It's evolving back around to where faculty end up engaged in mental health issues and are not experienced with it in some ways that would be helpful for them. But it's the model industry, I don't know, there are lots of things you can see when you look at trends at some places where artificial intelligence comes into play, or other things are coming in that may or may not affect the actual cost of instruction. I quickly say that I have a retired physician friend from many years now who was one of the best in his field. And he was told that his specialty, that he had to get a nurse practitioner or a physician's assistant to help him in his practice, or else the hospital wasn't going to take him in. This went back and forth for a while. Ultimately, they said, you can't practice here unless you do that. So he did it, and he came back and said to me, I now practice at the highest level of my certification. My patients are better served, and the costs are down and the price is down because I've been able to distribute some of those things that were lower in my practice.
Mm-hmm. Well, it makes perfect sense, but institutions, and we're talking a little bit about the technology aspects of it.
Clearly.
Institutions are slow to adapt technology. Set aside OPMs and all of that stuff.
Right.
Even just upgrading classrooms to where they are more functional with the labs that are needed. It's a significant expense. And there was an article that just came out in the Chronicle yesterday about mold in dorm rooms.
Yes, I saw
in
that.
South Carolina.
Right.
And, that gets into ongoing maintenance issues.
Yeah, deferred maintenance is a big budgetary problem
huge.
For a lot of places. Yeah.
It's huge. And so, technology, deferred maintenance, all these things just continues to eat into budgets.
Well, it does. And then also in our enterprise, we have a rich tradition of shared governance where a lot of things need to be listened to, but not always agreed to by the board and the administrations on campuses. And this has produced a high level of stress for presidents. And as I know, the average tenure is now somewhere just a little under, I think, 5 years on regularly appointed presidents. Mm-hmm. And that's very difficult when it comes to managing succession, when it comes to getting continuity and a strategy that's longer than a very near-term perspective. So I'm concerned that we need to make sure we listen carefully to faculty and that they feel as though they're heard. And I worked with some clients about 9 different principles of governance that includes attention to some of these issues. But anyway, the governance issue and the responsibility, when the real stress is there, the fiduciary responsibility that trustees or members of the governing board, by whatever nomenclature, are facing in different states and federally. And they face them in civil lawsuits when schools close, if they don't think they were handled right. But boards have a monitoring responsibility that's really adding to the stress level for board members as well as to presidents and other administrators.
And it becomes doubly difficult in public institutions where these board members are appointed by the governor, appointed by the legislature, something like that. Who is their fiduciary duty to? And are they independent? You know, one institution, we're doing a large project for one state flagship institution, and the bylaws for that say the fiduciary duties, you're responsible to the people of the state. It's like, wait a minute, their fiduciary duties are to the institution. So even your governing documents don't really understand fiduciary duties.
Well, I think, Drumm, that it's a false dichotomy, even in the public institutions. They can be held accountable for both. And when they're in conflict, it really complicates them proceeding with their best governance decisions because they can be contradictory to one another. And it's a challenge, but it's a false distinction in my view. You have to be responsible to the institution. And as a not-for-profit, you also have a responsibility to the public good and to the students and the alumni in those areas. It's a complicated job, and it's not just fundraising with the governing board anymore. There is a clear and defined set of fiduciary responsibilities.
It is, and they need to be spelled out
right.
more frequently nowadays, I think, you know.
Agreed. And it should be part of it should start with the orientation of each new trustee. First of all, you have to make up for the lack of that and have it generalized with your existing board. But as you take on new board members, that should be a core piece of the orientation process that institutions use.
I'll challenge you on that just a little bit.
Okay.
I think it needs to start before they come on the board. I think it needs to start with the nominating process of, do people understand what your duties are going to be? This is not going to be a cakewalk.
I don't disagree with that whatsoever. In fact, we're just using different language. I think the orientation starts with that, not just after you're fully appointed and sworn in, taken the oath of office. No, I couldn't agree more that it needs to be part of that.
But most places don't do that. I mean, it's a completely political thing. I remember, coming to New Mexico, which I'm going to say the governor here has done a really good job in appointing board members for the University of New Mexico system. The previous governor, and it was pretty clear knowledge that the way to get on a board was make a donation to the political campaign.
Right.
It's not that way anymore, but that's the way it is in most places.
Right. No, it's, and then people have their specific agenda or their specific goals for higher education that fit their other needs in life. I'm glad to hear New Mexico has fixed that.
Yes. So, and I hope I don't get in trouble for that last comment.
Well, you're on your own with that, Drumm.
Yeah, I hear you. Thank you. So there's no silver bullet for any of these fixes, but what are some of the things that you're seeing out there that's working?
2 or 3 things. Let's make it 3 or 4 things, and I'll try to be not too protracted in describing them. Number 1 is that I think presidents need to assume a role of teacher on the campus with faculty, with their trustees, with their staff, with their alumni, with their local chamber of commerce, with other people that will explicate what is going on in the enterprise that's challenging to higher education and how it's different from when most of them or many of them were in college, and what they might prefer to be the case because of these imbalances in supply demand related to demography and related to other cost structures that are steep and a tuition discount, all of those kind of things. I include in that we need to be spending some time educating the media personnel because they have their own agendas and their own business models to manage. And sometimes those then are at the expense of higher education, the interpretation of higher education dynamics that continue to keep the public underinformed from what they need to be. But that media education needs to be in there. Anyway, so that's one thing. The second thing is, I think that with the board especially, and the fiduciary thing that we were talking about, you need to get a set of metrics that are specific, distinctively address the issues of your campus, the mission and the program there, and to track them. I recommend the institution that there be at least a 2, if not 3-year history along each one of those ratios or those metrics, and a 4 to 5 year projection that is updated annually based on the audited reports at the end of each fiscal year. They need to monitor that so they know what the real challenges are in that situation.
Let's dig down on those just a little bit.
Okay.
The communication strategy, it used to be that you would build relationships with the media. Now it's much more about being sensational.
Right.
That's what sells newspapers.
Right.
But if you bring a new president comes in, bring the media in, have a conversation with them, build those relationships.
Right.
And that's for the board chair as well.
I agree.
Building those relationships.
Right.
It's so critical for getting your message out.
Couldn't agree more. And it just, real facts, real knowledge, and real trends can really be useful to the media. It serves them well in the long run, even though it probably doesn't feel like that to them in the early going.
No, you're absolutely right with that.
Yeah.
And then, you talked about using metrics, which are critical. One client that we've worked with, they're having to go back and change around their overall strategic plan. It was decent, but it could be improved.
Sure.
The big thing is, let's figure out what the metrics are that we're going to measure ourselves.
Right.
Here are the tactics, here are the strategies.
Yeah.
Let's get good objectives, good goals down there, which really is the responsibility of both the president and the board to do.
Totally. That's right. And these things, they have to be done. I recommend up to 9+ of those that need to be tracked that are the critical ones. But having said that, one of the other things that need to be looked at as you go through those year to year to year is, have we got the right ones? Are we missing one here that we didn't think of now that because of challenges in the marketplace should be looking at something different or something more? And maybe we drop 1 or 2 and replace it with 1 or 2 other ones in there. But that kind of oversight and engagement is something that's critically important for board members and for administrations to be responsible to their boards to report and correct this. The chief financial officer has a major responsibility in informing that and delivering those metrics on an annualized and continuing basis.
Absolutely. And, just for argument's sake, your strategic plan is a 5-year plan or whatever, and it goes from academic year, July 1 to June 30.
Right.
Your July or August board retreat that you should be looking at what was accomplished the last year. What are we going to accomplish this year? What are the right metrics? What do we need to change in the plan and the metrics?
Right. No, I couldn't agree more with that. And one of the related things that's often underlooked here is innovation is an important element under the present dynamics, but there needs to be in place on every campus, in Larry Large's judgment here, every campus should have a process that tests innovative ideas, that encourages to come from trustees, from staff, from administrators, from alumni, from whomever, but that before they're implemented, you've got to end up with a screening device that checks the market, that checks the business aspect of that, so that you don't these will fail sometimes, even when you do that. But the probabilities of them failing go way down if you have a standardized set of tests for innovative ideas before you jump to invest in them.
Mm-hmm. And you follow the Army. Being from the Navy, it really hurts me to say this, but follow the Army protocols of let's have a hot wash immediately after the program so we can learn from what we did well and what we didn't do so well.
Right. No, it's absolutely the case. As a former artillery person from the Army, I can say I like your comparison.
Is that why you don't hear so well? No, I'm just kidding.
No, that's actually it is. I was the lanyard puller on a 105 howitzer for a long time. So,
oh my gosh! Wow. Well,
anyway,
I just flew airplanes and spied on people, so
that's good.
It was a little simpler.
Good. Yeah. Well, this was before I went to college, so it was, and I learned a lot from it. It gave me a lot of discipline, so I don't regret that investment.
Neither do I. There's another thing that I'm not seeing colleges doing a whole lot of is succession planning.
Oh, I agree.
In corporate, which, I've got a corporate background before I came into education, there was always succession planning there. You knew that if you're president, you knew if the VP of enrollment, whoever got hit by a bus, you knew who would be stepped in,
right
then. And I don't see that.
Well, I actually, there's a little glimmer of optimism for me in that. I see it increasingly happening. I actually have a client whom I will not name publicly here, but I'm working on this challenge, and it's a model that I'm real pleased with, and I think it could be one that could be used in a number of institutions. So I see some attention being drawn to it, particularly as there are corporate members of governing boards who are looking at this and are making the same comparison, Drumm, that you're making to that. Why shouldn't we take a look at this? And I think we will increasingly see ourselves addressing succession. And it'll also be increasingly true because one of the other things that I see happening is that we're going to be moving increasingly into mergers and consortia of different kinds. And that's going to also, I think, give us good lessons to learn from our partners in those consortia. And it's because they meet, typically the ones that I'm familiar with and the ones I've worked with, they then have core board and then the institutional boards, and they meet, and the administration, they learn from each other, they get best practices, and they avoid errors at a greater percentage.
Well, we both know two of the best in that area is TCS education system and core education, both of which do a wonderful job.
Well, I know TCS well, and I know how clear and direct they are in what they're able to accomplish.
Mm-hmm. And, the last thing is, we're going to see closings.
Yes.
We are going to see closings. What are some of the things that you would suggest to an institution that discovers they really have to close?
Yeah. The thing that they have to do is transparency. They have to be out there sharing the trend lines from those ratios that we talked about a few minutes ago, about how those change. That has to be communicated to the community. And that community is the faculty, it's the staff, and it's alumni, and it's others. But they have to be able to do that. As we had some experience with one, and the phrase that we used there was closing with dignity and grace, because it needs to take care of the current students. You have to find what's called a custodial campus to send those students to finish and to have their records, the alumni records, both in physical form and in electronic form so that they can be managed by the receiving institution. There has to be some return on that investment for the receiving institution so that the closing institution has to do that prior to being completely bankrupt. And so that you can get some help, because you can't just dump a problem on a lot of other places and hope that they'll do their best. You have to structure that in a way. And there are some models there that I know work and that I've been involved with, closing one here in the state of Oregon. And there are other times when you see that where it doesn't happen. And then there are lawsuits, the fiduciary responsibilities of governing boards are challenged, presidents are challenged, security issues are having to be faced. even when you do it right, there are complications in that area. But closing is a process. And so, but to get ahead of that to where you can merge, like there's a really good example in Oregon where it's worked very well, and it's been publicly announced here, but the Willamette and the Pacific Northwest College of Art have found a way to combine their interests to protect the missions of both entities, and Willamette has done a real service of taking that and incorporating it into so that their infrastructure per student costs go down. And the mission of the PNCA has been really carefully preserved, and they provide leadership and supplement and expand the benefits to Willamette as well.
And that's one of those things that it's a joy to see. It's sad to see an institution have to close, but
Right.
they can do it. Dignity, grace, the consortium, the partnerships, things
Right.
like that are all critical.
Right.
Larry, I knew this was going to happen. We are out of time, my friend.
Okay. I'm
So-
sorry, I wandered
no,
off
no.
on some of these.
No, there's just so much to cover and so many different things going on. 3 takeaways for higher ed presidents and boards.
Okay, make sure that you don't try to make a distinction fully between the issues of developing that general education that produces critical thinking and what I like to call intellectual agility, so that as we change as a society, that needs to go forward so that the graduates and the alumni are not afraid to learn, that they look forward to that, they're eager to learn. You want to increase that appetite for learning. That's one of the goals of student success, in my view. The second part of that distinction, we still have to address the issues of how you make a living and to be responsive and integrate the preparation for career to the students who graduate at most of the institutions in the country. I wouldn't say all ever, but it's one of those things where I think you have to do both of those things. It's another one of those false distinctions if you get caught up trying to be one or the other. You need to do both of those things. That's something that I think presidents and boards need to be talking about. I think succession planning is another one that needs to be taken care of in that. And we've got to look at innovation in ways that will allow us to continue to grow and thrive, learning and evolving with what's going on in society and with our student markets. And I don't mean that in a negative or restrictive sense about the traditions of higher education, but we need to have business models that are going to be effective, because if the old bumper sticker says, if you don't have a margin, you don't have a mission.
That's so true. And just because you're nonprofit doesn't mean you
Right.
shouldn't be making profits.
Totally.
So what's next for you, Larry?
Oh, I'm working on artificial intelligence. I'd like to create something that's I'm going to call a certificate in that will develop a workforce that would help advise government committees and bureaus on how to and how not to evolve with artificial intelligence. I'm working on the coaching thing in ways and succession. And I'm very much involved with consortia and partnerships, and that I was a contributing author in the Kubo setting about something called winning combinations. And that is something that why do partnerships and mergers fail? Most of the time it's cultural and not being informed. It's about 30% of the time, it is basically that the two institutions, the two missions don't reconcile. But it's about 70% of the closings or the failures of merger investments, which can take a long time. There are real opportunity costs there if you're not careful. But those are the things I'm involved with, and I don't know, the development of something that I call the academic practitioner, the thing that parallels the medical thing. I did an interview on it with a healthcare international newsletter that compared the two business models and the challenges and what can we learn from each other. What is it that the medical world is doing business model wise that we could say, oh, that's a good idea, we could use it here, and vice versa. And then which ones do we avoid?
Absolutely.
Anyway, those are the issues that I'm working on.
Those are great. Well, thank you so much for being on the program. I've thoroughly enjoyed our conversation. And I look forward to the next time if you're willing to come back on the show again.
Oh, sure. I'd be happy to do that, Drumm. So I'll leave that to you if it works. And I just hope that our listeners are able to benefit from what we've talked about.
I certainly hope so as well. Larry, again, thank you, sir.
You bet.
Thanks for listening today, and a special thank you to Larry Large and for his sharing with us his insights on the state of higher education and what university presidents must do to turn the ship around. Our next guest is Dr. Jana Matthews, faculty president and professor at Rollins College, and author of the book The Benefits of Friends: Inside the Complicated World of Today's Sororities and Fraternities. Jana will be joining us to talk about the changing role of faculty and how they can help bridge the cultural divide with Gen Z.
Changing Higher Ed is a production of The Change Leader, a consultancy committed to transforming higher ed institutions. Find more information about this topic, along with show notes on this episode at changinghighered.com. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe to the show, and we would also value your honest rating and review. Email any questions, comments, or recommendations for topics or guests to podcast@changinghighered.com. Changing Higher Ed is produced and hosted by Dr. Drumm McNaughton, post-production by David L. White.